In 1845, Governor James Whitcomb appointed Dr. John Evans, Dr. Livingston Dunlap, and James Blake into a commission to establish a permanent home for the insane. That fall, they purchased the 160-acre farmstead of Nathaniel Bolton and his poet wife, Sarah, for $5,300 on the west side of Indianapolis. 3 years later, in 1848, the Indiana Hospital for the Insane admitted its first 5 patients. The hospital was renamed to Central Indiana Hospital for the Insane in 1889 and again to Central State Hospital in 1926. Central State's campus was made up of a pathological department, a sick hospital for the treatment of physical ailments, a farm colony where patients engaged in quote-unquote occupational therapy, a chapel, an amusement hall complete with an auditorium, billiards, and bowling alleys, a bakery, a firehouse, a cannery manned by patients, gardens, fountains, and 2 massive ornate buildings, one for male and one for female patients. The more ornate of the 2 massive buildings came to be known as the Seven Steeples Building. This building, which housed female patients, was designed using the Kirkbride Plan for mental health care facilities. This building, constructed in 1878, 30 years after the hospital was established, is the one I will specifically be focusing on. By the early 20th century, the state had built mental health institutions everywhere in the state, which relieved Central State Hospital of its overcrowded conditions at the time. In 1950, patient population reached 2,500. By the early 1970s, most of the hospital's Victorian-era buildings had been demolished, including the Seven Steeples building. Eventually, due to allegations of patient abuse and funding troubles, catalyzed an effort to forge new alternatives to institutionalization, which in turn led to the hospital's closure in 1994. Currently, although the Seven Steeples building is no longer there, the administration building remains and has subsequently been repurposed as apartments. To understand why the Seven Steeples building was designed the way it was, it's important to first get some background or context to what was believed to cause mental illness and how it was believed to be treated in 19th century America. A standard belief across many ancient cultures was that mental illness was seen as a supernatural in origin, usually the result of an angry god. People of those civilizations believed that a victim or group of people had somehow trespassed against their deity and were being punished as a result. Somewhere between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE, the Greek physician Hippocrates rejected the idea that mental instability was a result of supernatural wrath and wrote that imbalances in thinking and behavior were from natural occurrences in the body, in particular the brain. Hippocrates and 2 other prominent Greek thinkers developed the idea of there being 4 essential elements to the human body: blood, bile, black bile, and phlegm, of which human personalities could be attributed to the idiosyncratic balances of these so-called humors. When the humors were out of balance, mental illness was the result. The scientific revolution that had been taking place in Europe from the 16th, 17th centuries brought about a drastic shift in how the world was viewed. Specifically, in regards to human mental pathology, the shift represented a move away from spiritual explanations of why, as extrapolated from the Christian faith or worldview, towards the acceptance of new criteria for explanation, stressing the how rather than the why, that had characterized the Aristotelian search for final causes. For example, even the various names of the Central State campus of which the Seven Steeples building sat upon gives clues as to what the society at large believed about mental illness. The Indiana Hospital for the Insane and Central State Indiana Hospital for the Insane. At the time, the terms lunatic or insane were interchangeable and virtually synonymous terms used to describe the mentally ill. Today, using these terms would be considered abusive or politically incorrect along the lines of epithets. Words influence how people think. Antiquated terms like lunatic act as a sort of misnomer within the word itself. The word lunatic actually derives from the Latin word lunaticus, meaning of the moon or moonstruck, and was originally referred mainly to epilepsy and madness as diseases thought to be caused by the moon. Philosophers such as Aristotle and Pliny the Elder argue that the full moon induced insane individuals with bipolar disorder by providing light during nights, which could otherwise have been dark, and affecting susceptible individuals through the well-known route of sleep deprivation. Until at least 1700, it was also a common belief that the moon influenced fevers, rheumatism, episodes of epilepsy, and other diseases. In the jurisdiction of England and Wales, the Lunacy Acts of 1890 to 1922 referred to quote-unquote lunatics, but the Mental Treatment Act of 1930 changed the legal terms to person of unsound mind, an expression which was replaced under the Mental Health Act 1959 by was the term used in 1950 in the English version of the European Convention of Human Rights as one of the types of person who could be deprived of liberty by a judicial process. The 1930 Act also replaced the term asylum with mental hospital. Criminal lunatics became Broadmoor patients in 1948 under the National Health Service Act of 1946. On December 5, 2012, the U.S. House of Representatives passed legislation approved earlier by the U.S. Senate, removing the word lunatic from all federal laws in the United States. President Barack Obama signed the 21st Century Language Act of 2012 into law on December 28, 2012. Of unsound mind or non-compos mentis, alternatives to lunatic, the most conspicuous term used for insanity in the law in the late 19th century. Various treatments and recipes developed by Grecian physicians and thinkers such as laxatives, emetics, which are substances that would induce vomiting, leeches and cupping therapy, recipes consisting of aloes, black hellebore, and colocynth, tobacco extracting blood from the forehead, or tapping veins across the body to drain fluids away from the brain. Treatment, if provided, paralleled other medical treatments of the time, including bloodletting and purgatives. Bloodletting is claimed to have been the most common medical practice performed by surgeons from antiquity into the late 19th century, a span of over 2,000 years. The practice has now been abandoned by modern-style medicine for all except a very few specific medical conditions. In the overwhelming majority of cases, the historical use of bloodletting was harmful to patients. The traditional medical practice of bloodletting is today considered to be a pseudoscience. In Europe, additional forms of therapy for the mentally ill taken into the asylums that were available at the time included dousing the patients in extremely hot or cold water. The idea being that shock would force their minds back into a healthy state. The belief that mental disturbance was still a choice prevailed, so staff used physical restraints, straitjackets, and even threats to further try to cure patients. Drugs were sometimes given to the more dangerous and difficult patients. A Dutch doctor even developed a gyrating chair that was supposed to literally shake up the body's anatomy and blood to try to restore the balance of the humors, but only succeeded in rendering patients unconscious with no improvement in their condition. In Europe, it was typical for family to have custody of mentally ill individuals and for a long time was seen as a source of shame and humiliation. Many families resorted to hiding their loved ones in cellars, sometimes caging them, delegating them to servants' care, or simply abandoning them. Clergy had long recommended regular church attendance as well as religious pilgrimages as a cure for mental distress. If a family could afford the care, they could send their loved one to a private home, owned and operated by members of the clergy who would do what they could to offer some treatment and comfort. Countries with majority or politically established Catholic populations would often staff their mental health facilities with members of the clergy. In early 19th century America, care for the mentally ill was also almost non-existent. The afflicted were usually relegated to prisons, almshouses, or inadequate supervision by families. In 1792, French physician Philippe Pinel developed a hypothesis that mentally unhealthy patients needed care and kindness in order for their conditions to improve. Pinel was the founder of moral treatment. Moral treatment was an approach to mental disorder based on humane psychosocial care or moral discipline that emerged in the 18th century and came to the fore for much of the 19th century, deriving partly from psychiatry or psychology and partly from religious or moral concerns. Some of the tenets of the philosophy espouse patients' access to sunlight, freedom of movement, and the like. Moral treatment eschewed the traditional medical treatments commonly found in asylums, such as bloodletting and physical restraints, and instead focused on making the asylums more like a strict one household, instead of being caged and hidden away in cellars. Patients were expected to act civilized and polite, encouraged to consider the consequences of disruptive behavior, and participate in the maintenance of the facility. They would be subject to rules and surveillance, and given simple rewards and punishments as appropriate. This was the first time that the idea of rehabilitating mentally ill people back to recovery and eventual reintegration with their families and communities at large was floated. Doctors would encourage their patients to participate in manual labor and intellectual conversation, effectively training them to be healthy and contributing members of society again. This philosophy challenged the demonic explanations for insanity and emphasized the role of environment in determining character, and proper external conditions could induce derangement. The moral treatment system was optimistic that an appropriate environment could facilitate cure, especially for those with acute, not chronic, afflictions. Moral treatment developed in context of the Enlightenment and its focus on social welfare and individual rights. Leading the charge for change in America, Dorothea Dix was an early 19th century activist and nurse who championed mental illness treatment reform and led the crusade for the establishment of state-supported mental asylums. Through her efforts, the first state hospitals for the insane were built in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. She and other reformers sought humane individualized care with the rich and the poor housed together to ensure high standards for all. Another key figure in the early spread of moral treatment in the United States was Benjamin Rush, an eminent physician at Pennsylvania Hospital. He limited his practice to mental illness and developed innovative, humane approaches to treatment. Thomas Story Kirkbride was a physician, advocate for the mentally ill, and founder of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, and precursor to the American Psychiatric Association. Kirkbride pioneered what would be known as the Kirkbride Plan, which aimed to improve medical care for the insane through standardization of buildings that house patients. The Seven Steeples building was one of the two buildings on Central State's campus based on the Kirkbride Plan. The Kirkbride model that the Seven Steeples building was based upon was extrapolated from moral treatment philosophy and environmental determinism. Environmental determinism is the study of how the physical environment predisposes societies and states towards particular development trajectories. Moral treatment also arose concurrent to the Enlightenment. The Seven Steeples building was a physical embodiment of an ever-evolving shift or change in ideas at the time regarding what it means to progress towards greater liberation of the self and community away from unjust or inhumane governance or control, which ultimately has its underpinnings in the Enlightenment. The structural features of the hospitals, as designated by Kirkbride, were contingent on the theories regarding the healing of the mentally ill, in which the environment and exposure to natural light and air circulation were crucial. The hospitals built according to the Kirkbride Plan would adopt various architectural styles, but had in common the bat wing style of floor plan, housing numerous wings that sprawl outward from the center. The various design features of the Seven Steeples building had responded to the Enlightenment birth moral treatment approach, were an argument based upon the values of human happiness, individual rights, moral principle, partly induced by religious concerns, psychology, and was physically manifested into an environment that counteracted the negative effects of the inhumane and inhospitable conditions the mentally ill were kept in. Kirkbride wanted to design a place that represented the opposite of the terrible conditions the mentally ill were subjected to. In regards to housing and treatment of the mentally ill, the quality of one's environmental conditions can have a profound effect on the behavior and well-being of the individual. Specific design features of the Seven Steeples building that represented 1900s moral treatment philosophy that grounded his design included a floor plan with long, staggered, rambling wings, so each connected wing received sunlight and fresh air, which was believed to aid in healing the mentally ill. The staggered design allowed a hierarchical segregation of residents according to symptoms of illness. Each wing was subdivided by ward, with the more excited patients placed on the lower floors, farthest from the central administrative structure, and the better behaved, more rational patients situated in the upper floors and closer to the administrative center. Ideally, this arrangement would make patients' asylum experience more comfortable and productive by isolating them from other patients with illnesses antagonistic to their own, while still allowing fresh air, natural light, and views of the asylum grounds from all sides of each ward. The center of the building was comprised of an administration building, kitchens, public and reception areas, and apartments for the superintendent's family, with the two wings on each side of the building. The building form itself was meant to have a curvative effect, a special apparatus for the care of lunacy. Each wing housed a separate ward, which would contain its own comfortably furnished parlor, bathroom, closed room, infirmary, as well as a speaking tube, a dumbwaiter to allow open communication, movement of materials between floors. The furthest wings from the central complex of the building was reserved for the most excitable or most physically dangerous and volatile patients. Patient rooms were suggested to be spacious, with ceilings at least 12 feet high, but only large enough to room a single person. Architectural styles of Kirkbride plan buildings varied depending on the appointed architect, and ranged from Richardsonian Romanesque to Neo-Gothic. The Seven Steeples was a Victorian-style building. The richly ornamented civilized style of the building was a contrast to the squalid, uncivilized conditions the mentally ill were traditionally relegated to in the even earlier asylums and private homes. In addition to the intricate building design, the Seven Steeples building had spacious landscapes on the rear with views that was generally situated where it was in the abundance of adjacent wood and land that offered privacy from the surrounding community. The grounds were tastefully ornamented with gardens maintained by patients as part of the physical exercise and therapy. Eventually, as time passed, new generations of mental health professionals turned to fresh methods of treatment, psychoanalysis, drug therapy, etc., and the Kirkbride Asylum plan became obsolete, including the Seven Steeples building. By the 1960s, mental health administrators had come to realize that the institutional setting was neither particularly effective nor beneficial for its inhabitants, leading to hospitals across the country discharging many long-term patients. The Seven Steeples building was demolished in the 1970s. Central State continued its decline with a population that had dwindled to around 400 in the early 1900s, until allegations of mistreatment and several patient deaths forced Governor Evan Bayh to close the hospital in 1994. In conclusion, the Seven Steeples building is a physical manifestation of the ideals and spirit of mental illness treatment reform in 19th century America, which grew out of the larger Enlightenment movement and its ideals of social welfare and individual rights. The literal form and surroundings of the building followed a program that explicitly prescribed best practices of what was at the time considered to be the model of humanely housing and facilitating recovery from mental illness. Design ideas that have proven to have substantiation for their claims to facilitate healing, such as access to views of green space, has made it into contemporary practice in places such as hospitals. Although the Seven Steeples building arose out of a time where a significant portion of medical knowledge and language is now considered antiquated, pseudoscience, or politically incorrect, it was a significant push forward in the pursuit of human health and justice. It was progress, and progress is what you want as nations develop and acquire greater and greater means of knowledge that advance civility, dignity, health, and happiness for an increasingly larger and larger segment of the population.